Today we're going to lecture on the evolution of polyandry in acorn woodpeckers. We'll introduce you to this bird, which happens to be local. So if you become interested in it, you can go visit acorn woodpeckers if you drive east and go out into the more hilly areas before the desert. If you're familiar with the town of Julian, that's where they are. Last lecture, we talked about mating system. I developed the idea that we can start with monogamy. Monogamy evolves because we need two parents to raise the offspring because life is hard and a single parent will not be able to do it. And then we examined what happens if life becomes easier and you only need one parent. In other words, one parent can desert or leave. And that leads to promiscuous mating systems, polygynous mating systems. And then finally, I suggested that if life was really, really good, the production of eggs and sperm gametes becomes approximately equal. It can then open the opportunity for evolving polyandry. However, at the end, I also hinted that there was two paths to polyandry. One, the one that I just mentioned, if life becomes really, really good because there's lots of food. But it turns out that if life is extremely hard, polyandry evolves again. So that's an interesting dichotomy, the two extremes. Life is easy, life is extremely hard. Polyandry emerges as the mating system. Today we examine that one last case that I presented, polyandry evolving when life is really, really hard. To do that, we need to get to know this bird. It's called the acorn woodpecker. As all woodpeckers, they have a very sharp beak, and that beak is to basically use it as a chisel along dead wood, and they can dig into the wood to look for food, which case would be insect larvae, or they can use the beak as a chisel to make a hole, a cavity inside a tree, and that'll be their nesting hole, nesting cavity. And acorn woodpeckers actually do an extra with the ability they have to use their beak as a chisel. Acorn woodpeckers exist in the pink range on this map. If you look at the West Coast where we are, you'll see that acorn woodpeckers are found all along California, all the way up into Oregon. South of here, they're found in the Baja, and then through many parts of Mexico, all the way down to Central America. If you look carefully and find out where we are, which is right here, right? There's actually a little gap along the coast, so acorn woodpeckers are not found in San Diego. But as I said earlier, if you just drive eastward into the hill regions, especially if you go to Julian, you'll find them in abundance. So on a normal year, I would always tell students, if you become interested in this, take a weekend, get some friends, drive up to Julian, have some apple pie. If you're a meat eater, there's a restaurant that serves buffalo burgers, and then go out for a hike, and you'll see lots and lots of acorn woodpeckers, and you'll see many of the characteristics and features that we'll be talking about today. What's unique about acorn woodpeckers is the following. If you go to a population and sample them, you'll find monogamous pairs, 40% of the population, but 50% of the population will exist as trios, 3 breeding adults. 90% of those trios will be polyandrous. In other words, 3 birds, 1 female, and 2 males. I'll just refer to those as PA from now on. 50% of the population are trios, 90% polyandrous, 10% then are polygynous, 2 females and 1 male. This 90-10%, I just want to emphasize, refers only to the 50% of the trios. The population, 40, 50, and then the remaining 10% are very large polyandrous groups. So there's a bias in this population to have polyandrous trios. We're going to try to address that question. Why is polyandry more common in this species, the acorn woodpeckers, than the alternatives, which would be polygyny and monogamous pairs? I'll point out that monogamy is not absent, right? 40% of the population is monogamous, so there's actually a high degree of monogamy. But the majority of the population, 50%, are trios, and in those trios, 90% are polyandrous. To develop the ideas that we'll use to analyze this situation, why polyandry has evolved, we need to discuss, introduce to you a new concept that you may not or may have seen, but we'll review it. To do that, we go to another bird called the great tit, Parus major. This bird exists in the Europe-Asia region, extending all the way from Western Europe all the way to the eastern tip of Asia. It has been studied a lot, especially in Britain, so we know actually a good degree about this bird, and some of the features of this bird will become useful for us in today's discussion. This bird nests in cavities in trees. They will use this entrance into a cavity in which they'll build a nest. And this is a camera stuck into a nest. And you can see it from the entrance of the nesting cavity. The nest is lined with feathers and other soft materials. And then they'll lay a good number of eggs with these little speckled red dots. What people have done then is to count the number of eggs per nest. We refer to the number of eggs as being the clutch size, or sometimes also brood, B-R-O-O-D. Clutch size and brood number or size will be used synonymously in today's lecture. So here we have 4 plus 5, 9 eggs. This has turned out to be the average characteristic size for a clutch. This is then a distribution of the number of eggs found in many, many, many nests. So some nests have 2 eggs, some have 12, but on the average, 8 to 9 is the most common size. That's over here. This is referred to as optimal clutch size. In other words, there's a best number, kind of like selection for the middle when we discuss heterozygote advantage. There's some selective force that does not want clutch size to be small, and another selective force that does not want clutch sizes to be large, giving us some intermediate. There's actually evidence to show that there is such selective forces leading to this optimal size. This data comes then from observation of these birds and following the birds, and in this case, taking their weight measurements as the birds grow to a certain time point. So that's what's on the y-axis, weight of individual birds in grams. And over this x-axis is the clutch or brood size, how many eggs per nest. In doing this experiment, some manipulation was done, because if you go back to the previous slide, you'll notice that the largest clutches are 12 and they don't go beyond that. And 2, you don't have a clutch of 1, they're just too small. But yet here we have brood sizes of 1 and here 13, and I believe later on you'll see an even larger one. These nests were created by adding and removing eggs from the bird nest. So if a bird had 2 eggs and you remove 1, you created a 1 brood-sized nest. And over here, by taking the egg that we removed and adding it to another bird, this poor pair of birds now have a 13-egg brood, which is larger than what they will normally experience. But the outcome of this was that they're able to get a relationship between the weight of the young birds at a certain time point, usually by the time they leave the nest, and the size of the nest or the brood. And there's a negative relationship. There's a drop, suggesting therefore that the parents are unable to provision these babies. And if you're in a large brood, each baby is receiving less food, and therefore it is smaller and lighter in weight. So these babies from the largest nest, brood size 13, was averaging about 17.5 grams, whereas the nest with smaller brood sizes, 1 or 2 eggs, the babies were 19.5 grams. We have talked a lot about sizes of offspring, the size of the young, as an indicator of how well they will do into the future. We talked about that in the genomic imprinting lecture, saying that having a large baby gives you a higher fitness because those babies will do better after they leave and grow up. This is, again, a similar statement. And in this case, we actually have data supporting the fact that being slightly heavier is beneficial. This was done by following the nest after, following the babies after they leave the nest. And this is done by a process called mark and recapture. Mark and recapture consists of the following. Here we take a baby bird. This is not the gray tit. This is another bird I'm just using for illustration. If you notice on the leg of this baby bird, there's a little metal band. This metal band will have numbers. Therefore, this baby bird is recognized as an individual. We know which nest it came from. We knew the weight of this bird when it left the nest because this was done before they flew off. The feathers are still small, so they're unable to fly at this stage where the band was put on. So these leg bands identify each bird, and if we can then follow the birds as they fly away from the nest and see how well they do, we have an idea, a measure of, if you wish, a fitness, because you have to survive to reproduce, you have to be there to reproduce, and then we can see whether this measure of fitness shows any relationship with the weight of the bird when it left the nest. To recapture the birds, they put up nets, very fine nets, dark in color. These are called mist nets, and M-I-S-T. And in the twilight, early morning, or after sunset, these nets are hard to see, and the birds will fly into them, become entangled. Researchers work quickly and remove the birds from the nets before they get harmed. And during that process, they can record the leg band numbers and find out which bird this is. And as a result, we collect data on how well the birds do, basically hang around and be available to be recaptured. So here are some hypothetical examples of data that one can get. Imagine that I had a nest, a brood of 7 babies, and I mark all the babies with a red leg band. It will also have a number so I could identify them individually. Birds from another nest where the brood was larger, 14 babies, I put a blue leg band. They fly away, I put up a mist net, I capture the babies, and I see how often do I get red ones, how often do I get blue ones. Hypothetically, if I recapture all 7 of the red ones and all 14 of the blue ones, I can say that they all survived really, really well because they all were there for me to recapture them. So being part of a brood of 7, despite the fact that I'll be heavier and fatter, does not increase my chances of surviving after I leave compared to a nest which had 14. These 14 birds were smaller and lighter, but yet they did just as well through this measure of mark and recapture. That will be if I get all 7 and all 14. Now, reality is that I'll never get all 7 and all 14. Some birds die accidentally, irregardless of what their weight is. They just are unlucky, or they'll fly away. So I'll never expect to recapture 7 and 14. I expect to recapture a fraction of them. What happens if I recapture 1 and 2? Well, the ratio is 1 and 2, which is the same as the ratio of 7 and 14. So the recapture rate, if it were 1 and 2, would still indicate that being from a nest with 7 or 14 makes no difference. Being smaller and lighter from a nest of 14 doesn't give you a disadvantage because I'm getting the same ratio. What would be of interest is if the ratio was not 1 to 2, but say something like 2 to 1. In other words, I'm recapturing more often the red ones, twice as often, despite the fact that they came from a nest with only 7 babies. But those 7 were heavier and fatter, and presumably that's why they were able to survive better, and that's why I got a flip of the ratio from 2 to 1 initially, 1 to 2 initially to 2 to 1. And one final point, reality is that we're going to get fractions, right? And sometimes when I say that, students ask, you can get a fraction of a bird? No, I cannot. But if I do many, many nests, I can average them, and the average will show fractions. So this will be 1.7 versus 0.7. It is kind of like 2 to 1, showing that the nests with smaller birds are creating fatter birds that do better. This data then is expressed as recaptures per brood. So here's the data from the recapture study. On this axis, the number of birds recaptured, not that many. The most is you recapture 1 from a brood, a nest. Averaging it out, you get nice data, and it shows a humped curve. Begins low, increases, flattens out, and then shows a decrease. Of course, we would like to have more points down here. These red ones were created by adding eggs to nest, and researchers hesitated because if you start adding many more eggs to the nest, you're basically overloading the parents, and I presume the researchers did not want to overdo it. But here's the distribution, and the maximum in terms of recapture per broods, which would be indication of the fitness or healthiness of the birds and their ability to survive after they leave the nest, is around this region here, which is 8 to 9, coinciding to the clutch size that was most common. So what are the forces that are shaping this? If there's an optimum by having a I'm forgetting the word, a humped curve, there must be a force that's pushing me out and a force that's pushing me in, leading to this optimum. They're both forces of natural selection. What is this one? Well, it turns out the force that's selecting for larger clutch size here is very simple. It is simply a numerical one. If I have a small number of eggs, 2 or 3, 1, I'm not going to have too many recaptures simply because I didn't have that many babies. So the advantage that you get on this side, the increase, is simply a numerical advantage of having more eggs. Small clutches are numerically bad. So birds have larger clutches because more eggs is more babies. This explains then the increase in recapture on this edge of the curve. What is selecting then on this side to oppose large clutches? That then is the ideas that we gave you earlier, that large clutches are hard to feed. Parents cannot provide food to large clutches. The babies end up being smaller, lighter, and weaker. As a result, they don't do well, are recaptured at a lower frequency, and that leads us then to the optimal clutch size. We will use the concept at this end that large clutches are harder to feed, that the parents will have a harder time provisioning, and therefore you'll get less healthy and lighter birds, this end, in the discussion about the acorn woodpecker. That's the concept that I wanted to develop. This is reminding you then that the optimal clutch size is here, and that coincides with this number of eggs, which is right where the most common nest size is observed in the great tit. So, back to life at heart and polyandry. Life really hard. How hard is it? That will lead to the evolution of polyandry. Monogamy was hard because one parent couldn't do it. So I needed to have two parents, and therefore I evolve a monogamous pair. If I make life even harder, then it's going to be that two parents alone cannot raise the offspring. What is the solution? You add more parents. In other words, we're going to go beyond monogamy. Monogamy gives me two parents, which is natural because I have a male and a female. But if they cannot do it, I'm going to need more parents. So we have the evolution of what is known as cooperative breeding. Cooperative breeding is when several adults, mature reproductive adults, get together, and as a mating group that's larger than a monogamous pair, they will then mate and produce offspring and raise it as a communal group. This is called cooperative breeding. Acorn woodpeckers practice cooperative breeding. So here's a trio. And I showed you data earlier that trios and even larger groups are quite common, accounting for 50% of the population. As I indicated earlier, acorn woodpeckers use the chisel beak that they have to make cuttings, dents, holes in trees. But they also fly around and look for food, which will be in the form of insects, some of which come from rotting wood. But in this case, this is a flying insect that the acorn woodpecker has caught. Acorn woodpeckers eat insects as most other birds and woodpeckers, and they will use these insects to provide protein. The adults will use that, they'll eat it because they need protein, but a lot of the protein is used for raising the young. Growing young individuals need to develop muscles, and most of the body is made out of protein, so having a good protein source is very important. And insects are rich in proteins. But to find proteins to feed the young, birds have to fly. And acorn woodpeckers then eat acorns and use it for the energy required for flight. Acorn is just basically a starch. If you go and look online on organic food, you'll find what is known as acorn flour. It is just an alternative to flour that now has become popular to replace wheat for people that cannot eat high content of gluten, which is a wheat protein. So the acorns provide them energy for flight, which they then use to find insects to feed the babies. That may seem like an easy life. If you drive up to Julian, you may recognize countryside terrain such as this. If you drive up to Julian, see the acorn woodpeckers, or you start climbing the hills, look around, you're going to see these yellow, kind of burnt out grassy hillsides with lots of short, dense trees. These are the oaks that produce the acorns that the woodpeckers eat. This is called scrub oak, and they'll produce acorns. So life couldn't be much easier, right? All these trees around, acorns coming. You just have to go there, get the acorns, eat them, look for insects, and then feed your young. But life is complicated. And it's complicated because acorns don't want to be eaten. Acorn oak trees that make acorns don't want their acorns to be eaten by predators, which in this case are the acorn woodpeckers. As a result, acorn trees, oak trees, time the production of acorns in a very coordinated and cycling manner. So here's a graph, and over here is years, 1995 to 2016. And this is the production of acorn over these years. And there are boom years with lots and lots of acorn. Then it crashes down to almost zero. And then there are dry years for 3-4 years. And then there's another boom, 3-4 years, 6 years, another boom, another boom. But lots and lots of in-between years where there's no acorn. That causes a problem for the birds that eat the acorns. And that's what the oak trees want. The oak trees do not want a predator that's eating their acorns all the time. So instead of making a steady amount of acorns, they make it in excess some years. So the birds cannot eat everything, and therefore some acorns escape and germinate into new trees. This process is called mass fruiting by the acorns, and it is often argued to be a mechanism to keep the density of predators low, because the predators now have to go through starvation years, so they cannot, the predators cannot increase to large numbers, which will be then bad for the oak trees. How do acorn woodpeckers deal with this problem? Acorn woodpeckers store acorns from the good years in what are known as granaries. Granaries is just an old word for grain storage. They basically store acorns for using during the hard years. And the way they do it is, being woodpeckers, they can make little holes in the trees, and then they stick an acorn in it, and they'll store hundreds, if not thousands, of tens of thousands of acorns, and they'll guard it because that's their food bank, and they'll carry them through the bad years. They'll use trees, and in this case, a very industrial acorn woodpecker has used a telephone pole, and it was perfect, right? It's a soft old wood. The acorn woodpecker can make a hole, and then it wedges these acorns in, so they're now protected, and they can use it at a later time. Building these big reserves of food, the granaries, is going to be very laborious. Breeding pairs, breeding trios, and breeding groups will create, and these trees will last for decades, if not centuries, of course, being passed on from family to family. And the acorn woodpeckers will defend them because, of course, that's their food. In these trees, they will also build their nests. So here's an acorn woodpecker that has made a hole cavity inside here, and that's where they will have a nest and raise their offspring. But in this case, a lot of these holes are empty, but their food then is right around them. And as I said earlier, they'll defend their food and nest because they're so close to each other. Because of this process of having to collect food in this manner, one believes then that life is hard, and as a result, cooperative breeding evolved. So the graph that I show you here is a demonstration that cooperative breeding is beneficial. On the x-axis is breeders per nest. So I'm going to compare only monogamous pair and breeding trios. So monogamous pair will be this 2 here, 2 breeders per nest. And the trio will be here, 3 adult birds at the nest. On the y-axis, I give you the number of babies that fledge, estimated by mark and recapture. What's the relationship? If we look first at the monogamous pair, we see that on the average, 1.6 babies fledge. That's not very good. Both of these examples that I'm talking about, the birds will have laid 4 eggs. We think that 4 eggs is the optimal size, and I'll show you a little bit data of that later. But let's assume that 4 eggs is the optimal size. The breeders with 2 adults, despite the fact they have 4 eggs, manage only to raise successfully 1.6. They're having a hard time feeding the 4 babies, and they end up only provisioning successfully 1.6, being those that are to be recaptured and observed. However, if you add another adult, another breeder, and go to 3, 3 becomes then a much more comfortable number, and those 3 are able to raise those 4 eggs quite successfully, and 4 of them are observed to fledge. That's a big difference. So having 3 adults gives you an advantage, and that's beneficial. I want to point out that this line here is done by what we call regression, right? If you've done some lab class, you know that if you have a cloud of points, you can use statistical packages to fit a best line. In reality, the data is not this clean, but this is real data. There'll be a cloud right here. There'll be a cloud right here. We can fit a line, and this is the best we get. But it shows a very strong relationship. The other graph that we need for today's discussion then is the graph that represents optimal clutch size for acorn woodpeckers. So this is a graph you've seen before. I'll walk you through. Clutch size over here, number of eggs per nest, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We do get clutches that are bigger, but we don't see clutches that are smaller than 4. So acorn woodpeckers seem to pretty much concentrate of having a clutch size of 4, and we'll see bigger clutch sizes. But those bigger clutch sizes are detrimental because on the y-axis is fledgling per nest. If you have a larger clutch of 8, which is right here, you fledge only 2.8. If you have a clutch size of 4, you fledge 4. All these nests that I'm talking here have 3 breeders per nest. The data was collected this way so that we can make comparisons. Otherwise, there's too many variables. So in this case, we held 4 eggs to be constant, and here we held 3 breeders because we're interested in trios. So clutch size and fledgling success, if you wish, think of the y-axis as fitness as a function of clutch size. There's a decline. Why? Large clutches are bad, and that's the same argument that I gave you when we talked about optimal clutch size. Over here, breeders per nest, you can think of the y-axis as fitness. More breeders, higher fitness. These 2 points are the same. So that's a way that you connect these 2 graphs. Why are they the same? Well, this point corresponds to a clutch size of 4 with 3 breeders. That's the same thing here. Breeders, 3, 4 eggs. So this point and this point are the same. What's our objective? What we want to understand is why is it that when we have trios, which are beneficial, as shown by this graph, 90% of them are polyandrous. That is the bias that we want to explain. We know that trios are good. That's what this data shows. 2 breeders, 3 breeders, 3 breeders, higher fitness. In this data set, we made a distinction between polyandrous or polygynous trios. We want to do that now and explain why they are 90% of the trios. Let's look at it from the perspective of a monogamous pair. You're not doing as well as a trio, so you should add, a monogamous pair should add a breeder. That will make it a cooperative breeder, which is good. But should you add a female or a male? Or should it not matter? Because if you add a female, you'll become a polygynous trio. If you add a male, you'll become a polyandrous trio if you are a monogamous pair. They seem to add preferentially males. And they seem to care a lot. One thing I mentioned earlier, that monogamous pairs, especially in birds, are very hard to differentiate. You cannot tell a male from a female. That was what happened when I show you the albatrosses in Midway Island. The male and the female looked identical. We can only tell them apart by the leg band. Acorn woodpeckers, if you look at them, you may think that they look the same, but they have evolved very strong signals to what is a male, what's a female, as if they're keeping track of the ratio of males and females in a trio. In other words, they want to know whether it's polygynous or polyandrous. This is a male, and if you look at its head, the color pattern is red-white. A female is red-black. So if acorn woodpeckers are looking at each other directly head-to-head, it becomes very clear which is a male, as a female. Here, red and black. Here, the black is gone. Basically, what has happened is the red cap in the male has grown to be larger and has edged forward, and this red in the male has come forward and covered the black band. You can kind of see kind of the dark roots underneath the red hair here. Red-white male, red-black female. Here's a trio with a nest cavity, and this happens to be a trio that's polyandrous. Male here, red-white, and the female here, it's white-black, and the red is behind there. You can't see it, but there's a black one separating the white and red, which is lacking in the male. So this is a polyandrous trio with their nest hole, the females inside with the nest. Who should you add if you're a monogamous pair? Because that's how trios will be created. We're going to evaluate who you should add by calculating the fitness of males and females in monogamous pairs, polygynous and polyandrous trios. We're going to walk through that one by one. We'll use this data first, and we're going to calculate the fitness of the monogamous pairs. The fitness of monogamous pairs is going to come from this graph where I show you breeders, 2 and 3 on the x-axis, and on the y-axis what I call fitness. So we're going to use those numbers. Well, if you're a monogamous pair, where do you fall on this graph? Well, you have 2 breeders, so you're right here. 2 breeders gives me 1.6 fledglings. Let's say that is my fitness. So the fitness of a monogamous pair would be 1.6, and that would be the fitness of a male and the fitness of a female. 2, 1.6, and that's the value. I don't have any other parents, so all the babies in this 1.6 fledgling number belong to the male and female, and I just give it to them equally. So 1.6 is the fitness of an acorn woodpecker that is part of a monogamous pair. How about polygynous and polyandrous trios? We can also get it from this graph because I have here 3 breeders, and 3 breeders produces 4 eggs. And those 4 eggs lead to 4 fledglings. I have trouble pronouncing certain words today. 3 breeders, 4 eggs, 4 fledglings. So the fitness is 4. So let's calculate then the fitness first for a polygynous group. Here it is. I'll walk you through. I'm going to do it for the female because it's a little bit more complicated. And if you understand the female, you understand the male. Remember, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a polygynous group. So there's 2 females and 1 male. How many offspring do they raise successfully? 4. So that's why this red is 4. 4 is the number of eggs per nest. And how many do they raise? I should actually change this. This shouldn't be eggs. This should be the number that fledge. Okay, your handout will say eggs. And I got distracted because it was 4 and 4, so I put number of eggs. It should be fledged because fledge is fitness, right? So the female of a polygynous polygynous female, is 4 because that's a number they raise successfully. However, there's 2 females there, and there are 4 eggs. So assuming that the females split the eggs, 4 split evenly would be 2. Only 2 out of those 4 eggs would belong to 1 female. So 4 fledglings or fitness, but a female only gets half of it, and that's this 2 divided by 4. If you calculate this out, it's 2. Therefore, the fitness of a female in a polygynous group is 2. The male, he's the only one. So 4 will be fledged. He gets all 4 eggs because he's the father and he mated with both females. So his paternity is 4 out of 4 eggs. Whereas for a single female, her maternity is 2 out of 4 eggs. Therefore, the fitness of the female is cut in half, and that's 2. Just make sure that you note down that this is supposed to be fledged and not eggs. Let me erase this. With this, we can also calculate the fitness of the polyandrous trio. Right here. For the polyandrous trio, I only have 1 female. So all the eggs belong to her. So here's the 4, indicating that 4 fledglings are produced by this group because there's 4 breeders. But all 4 eggs are hers, so 4 out of 4 is her ownership. So her fitness now is 4. But there's 2 males, so they have to share paternity for the 4 eggs. So this is 2 over 4. That's the share of a single male of the 4 fledglings that were raised successfully by them. So the male fitness now in the polyandrous group is 2. This is then the mirror image of a polygynous group. We just flip it because in one case I have 2 females, in the other case I have 2 males. Is this fitness good or bad? Well, you have to compare relative to the monogamous pair. And going back to what I did earlier, the monogamous pair is 1.6. So clearly, if there's advantageous, it is advantageous for the birds to go into a trio. A monogamous pair should attract a adult breeder, and from this analysis, attracting a male or female would be good. Attracting a female and making a polygynous group would decrease the fitness of a female, but not by much, not sufficiently so that 2 is then smaller than what they get as a monogamous group. They don't. The females get 2, which is larger. If you attract a male, the female then has a high fitness of 4, but the males are still not doing well because 2 is greater than 1.6. So this doesn't tell us why polyandry should be more common than polygyny. Both of them should occur equally frequently, because if I have a 1-to-1 sex ratio, attracting a male or a female should be equally easy, and therefore polygyny and polyandry should be equally common in the trios. But it is not. We see more polyandrous trios. So why are polyandrous trios more common than polygynous trios? To do that, we need to examine more a polygynous trio using the data that we have collected. And we're going to ask this question. In a polyandrous trio, I have 1 female. In a polygynous trio, I have 2 females. In a polyandrous group, the single female controls egg laying. In a polygynous trio, the 2 females can lay eggs. That creates a conflict. And what this is going to take us to is that in a polyandrous trio, because I only have one female, she can have an optimal clutch size because that's best for the nest. In a polygynous trio, because I have two females and both females can lay eggs, the conflict creates a situation where it's beneficial for a female, one of those two, to add an egg and therefore increase the clutch size beyond the optimum of 4. Let's walk through that. So here I draw for you what happens to a polygynous group, polygynous trio, reminding you that this is the fitness of the monogamous male and female. I keep it up there only for reference, but we want to discuss a polygynous trio. The male, being single, has a fitness of 4. The female split the eggs, so they have a fitness of 2. I'll use green and red to represent the two females. Optimal clutch size of 4, 2 red eggs, 2 green eggs. What will happen if a female adds 1 egg? The clutch size is now 5. It is over optimal. I let the green female add an egg first. So here is the nest now with 5 eggs. What is the consequence of adding 5 eggs? We can use our data to calculate the consequences. Clutch size go from 4 to 5. We still have 3 breeders, right? Because we're talking about a polygynous trio. But the number of babies that fledge now is smaller because I have 5 eggs, which is larger than the optimum. More specifically, 5 eggs, 3 breeders, fledgling is 3.7. That means that the fitness of a polygynous trio, which has an extra egg, becomes what I show you over here. There's only one male, so his fitness is 3.7, and that's right here. The green and red females, however, will have a different fitness. There's 3.7 fledglings or fitness units to be divided among the females. But one female, by having 3 eggs, she has a larger share, 3 over 5. The other 2, having only laid her 2 normal eggs, her share is only 2/5 of 3.7, which is 1.48. So the green female, by adding an egg, has benefited. She had a fitness of 2 before. Now she's 2.22. But the red one has been cheated. She had a fitness of 2. She is now 1.48. And 1.48, if you notice, is worse than 1.6. So the red one now is put in a situation where she joined the trio to get a higher fitness, but because the green one had an extra egg, she's now worse off than if she had remained in a monogamous pair. Male still good, green did well, red worse than monogamy. What should the red do? The red could leave and try to find another male and become monogamous, but that's bad because you may not find another male or territory. You can expel the green. The red one can basically have a fight with the green and kick the green one out. Then the red one will become monogamous. But that means that you can expel the green one. It may be easier to add an egg herself. What will happen if the red female added an egg? So here we have it. Red adds an egg. Clutch size is 6. I think you should see the pattern now, right? We go back to this graph. 3 breeders, because we're still talking about a polygynous trio. Clutch size has gone to 6, however. With clutch size of 6, 3.4 fledged. That's the fitness. So the fitness of the females now and male will be what's shown here. Male 3.4 because he's the only one. 3 eggs, 3 eggs. So the 2 females, red and green, will have the same fitness because They share now 3 out of 6 eggs each. They possess that 3 out of 6 eggs each. So they basically get 1/2 of 3.4, which is 1.7. Equality has been brought back to the nest. Females do better than monogamy, right? 1.7 is better than 1.6. Will this system remain stable? Will they now be happy and realize that it was not good to add an egg because they actually lost something before they were 2.0, right? When they had 4 eggs, 2 each. But 1.7 is still better than monogamy, so maybe they should stop and stay here. Will they do that? Is there incentive to add more eggs? I'm not going to go through the whole steps every time now. I'm just going to start showing you the data. This is the sequence that we developed by going through the data step by step. This is the last calculation I showed you where the females were getting 1.7 each. Is there temptation to add one more egg? Let's check. Why stop at 6 eggs? Let's go to 7. So this is what happens if the one female, in this case, ours has the green one adding first. The green one adds one more egg. Her fitness from this graph, right, will be then 4/7 out of 3.1. That's 1.77. The red one loses, becomes 1.33. What's the red one to do? Fight with the green one or add an egg herself? What will happen if the red one adds an egg? Red adds an egg. We have now 8 eggs. Fitness now drops to 1.4. And that's this value over here, 2.8, right? And we got to divide it by half because they share it. 2.8 divided by 1/2 is 1.4. If the red one adds an egg, we get equality again. But 1.4 is less than 1.6. So now both females are doing worse than if they were monogamous. And adding more eggs now is not going to rectify anything. It'll just make things worse. 8 eggs is a threshold. When they reach 8 eggs, the acorn woodpeckers actually then do something very dramatic. They escalate. They get worse than monogamy. And when that happens, the females will now start fighting and the nest is destroyed. They begin by destroying each other's eggs. And eventually the fight is so intense that the mating group basically is scattered. They no longer can hold the territory. Their investments have not worked. This is the consequence of what happens in a polygynous group because their incentive for the females to add an extra egg. They're unable to cooperate because they can lay an extra egg. Here's a picture of a female, red and black, right? Red and black is a female, destroying an egg. She's basically picking up eggs, which I presume she knows or thinks belongs to the other female, and is chucking them outside of the egg and destroying them. Realize that this is happening only in a polygynous group, and in a polyandrous group, a polyandrous trio, we don't have such problems. Why don't we have such problems? Because there's only one female and she controls the egg laying. So there's no other female that can add an extra egg. So she says 4 eggs, that's all we're having. And the polyandrous trio of the 2 males and 1 female are going to raise only 4 young coming from 4 eggs. And therefore they do well. Now the males can cheat and try to mate more than the other male. But the female has some control over mating. So the female has the incentive to distribute her mating with both males to provide them incentive to stay and not fight. So it is to the female's advantage in a polyandrous trio to mate with both males so that they both have paternity and they both have a fitness contribution. And because she has some control over mating and over egg laying, a polyandrous trio can be kept in harmony to a higher degree more easily than a polygynous group where the females can control individual egg laying, and that leads to the conflict. This is the graph that I finally gave you, leading the process from monogamy to a polygynous trio, working up, adding eggs, and finally to the breakdown when the fitness of the females are less than what they would achieve with monogamy at 1.6. I want to discuss a little bit more this series of analysis by focusing on what's been boxed out. This is the transition from a polygynous trio, starting with 4 eggs, which is the optimum, moving up to adding 1 egg each, so the clutch size is now 6, and fitness begins dropping. I could extend the analysis, but this analysis gives us a pattern that I want to discuss. So here it is. This set of numbers allows us to create a matrix where over here I place the green female and whether she has 2 eggs or 3 eggs. Over here is the red female, whether she has 2 eggs or 3 eggs. And what we're going to put into this matrix is the fitness of the birds. So in this quadrant over here, basically green has 2 eggs, red has 2 eggs, and what we're going to put in here is the fitness of these 2 females. We can go over here and find that number. This is a polygynous trio. We're trying to understand why they're unstable. And the fitness of a female in a polygynous trio is 2, right? 4 eggs, 2 each. So I'm here 2, 2. Fitness is 2, so I should write 2, 2 here. And I can do that from the yellowed line. Red is the fitness of the female. Green is the fitness of the green female, or female number 2. I can walk through the rest of the numbers and place the numbers on this matrix and fill them out. Here is what happens if green female has 3 eggs, red female has 2. Green female would be 2.22, red female would be 1.48. Then I can have the addition of more eggs, and if I walk through that, the final graph will look like this. This is then the fitness as a function of what the females do. 2 eggs, 3, oh, I didn't change this one. This is a 2. I'm going to change it black. This is a 2. This is a 3. I believe I changed it on the... Yeah, I changed it here, but I didn't change the next slide. That was a typo because the lines are inverted when you do a vertical axis. Of course, this has to be a 2 because female 2 adds 2 eggs. Given this graph, given this matrix, we can talk about evolution, because we always argue that evolution favors increasing fitness. If it's going to increase fitness, organisms will evolve that particular trait, or in this case, behavior, egg laying. So from the red's perspective, we always expect the red to move from this quadrant to this by going from 2 to 3. And that's true regardless of what female 2 has done. If female 2 has 2 eggs, I go here. If female 2 has 3 eggs, I go from 1.48 to 1.7. It is always good for female 1 to have an extra egg. By that same argument, it is always good for female 2, the green one, to add an extra egg. What this means then is that if I have this type of matrix, evolution will always take me by this path or this path to this final quadrant where the fitness of the group, the two females in a polygynous group, is the lowest. This turns out to be what we call the payoff matrix using game theory. And some of you may have taken a class where they talked about this. This is what they call the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is a game that was developed for economics, and it uses the idea that if two individuals who've committed a crime together are caught by the police, but the police has no witness, so the police tries to coerce the two criminals to point finger at their partner. And the police says, if you point your finger, we'll reward you and let you go. So that provides an incentive for criminal number one to accuse criminal number two, criminal two to accuse criminal number one. And because they point fingers at each other, because they've been promised to be released, they now end up being accused, and there's a witness, so they both end up in jail. And that's how you end up in the lower quadrant, where the outcome is the worst possible. I never liked prisoner's dilemma, because if the police had said that, if you point your finger, I'll let you go, and then when they point the fingers at each other, the police renege on their promise to let them go, that doesn't flow well, right? I never liked prisoner's dilemma as an example of prisoner's dilemma. Acorn woodpeckers, I believe, provide a much better example. Adding an egg improves individual fitness, but the whole nest suffers because you're above the optimal clutch size. In this case, prisoner's dilemma results as a consequence of the fact that the unit of selection is the individual. Natural selection maximizes individual fitness, and that leads to the behavior of these birds to go from 2 eggs to 3, from 2 eggs to 3, both from the perspective of red and green females. The group is the nest. The group would benefit by having an optimal clutch, but in this case, the nest is not the unit of selection, and individual selection is overriding it. This then explains acorn woodpeckers and evolution of polyandry. Polyandry is the main system because PG, polygyny, is stopped by PD, prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is the topic of the next lecture, so that'll be next week. And I'd like to finish today then by going through 2 more examples of polyandry and cooperative breeding when life is really, really hard. They'll be very similar to acorn woodpeckers. They have the same characteristics: hard life, cooperative breeding, and the preference for polyandry. One example comes from what are known as the naked mole rats. These are rodents, and they live in this eastern corner of Africa, very large desert region. And these are basically rodents that have evolved to live in the desert. Desert is hard place to live. Reason being that there isn't much water, therefore not too much food. The sun is strong. As a result, organisms have to figure ways to get out of the sun. I'm trying to get rid of the eraser here right now. Come on, go away. Oh, I gotta go here. And how can you get away from the sun in the desert? Well, you go underground. So what the naked mole rats have gone underground and they dig themselves tunnels. And this way they can protect themselves from the sun. And usually the ground is cooler than the surface temperature. So that allows them to escape. But it is still pretty hot in there, and they have evolved total loss of their hair because they don't need it now to protect it from the sunlight, right? Hair protects you from the sunlight and burning your skin, but they're now living underground, so they might as well shed their hair and their clothes. So they're basically naked, hairless. But food is not very abundant in the desert, and the main things they grow are some plants, and naked mole rats basically live on roots of plants. Some of these are tubers, so they're bigger, they have more water, but they get everything they need, or what they are able to survive on are these roots. So the diet is very low in calories. They do get their food, but their living is being underground with a very low calorie source of food. Air down here is not very healthy. Oxygen levels go so low that they sometimes pass out and they go into torpor. So they basically lie there until air comes back and then they wake up. But they're trying to dig their way through tunnels, find roots to eat, and raise a family. They have evolved polyandry by evolving cooperative breeding. There's a female, a single one, that's the queen, and she's the mother to this whole pile of babies. There'll be 1 to 3 males developing, therefore, into a polyandrous system. It is believed that this evolution of polyandry follows a model similar to what is seen in acorn woodpeckers, presumably because there's an optimal clutch size, number of babies that a female can have in this harsh environment with the help of 1 or 2 or 3 males. Whereas if I had polygyny, I'll have several queens and therefore a much larger clutch size that would not be supported by the mating group. The final example of polyandry takes us back to something you've seen before. These are the golden lion tamarins. I introduced to you golden lion tamarins when we talked about genetic drift, how the zoos wanted to bring in a population from Brazil and keep them captive and breeding in the United States and Europe to some future time, 200 years into the future, when hopefully the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil would be saved and they could reintroduce the monkeys to Brazil in case they had gone extinct in Brazil during those 200 years. In establishing capture breeding populations, they had them in zoos, and I mentioned the fact that initially they thought that these tamarins, like most monkeys, are polygynous. So they established polygynous groups, and the females fought, and it was not successful until they switched to monogamy. What I didn't tell you was, although they switched to monogamy, monogamy works, but it is not the natural mating system of the golden lion tamarins in Brazil, in nature. In Brazil, they appear to be more polyandrous. Oh, I got it backwards here. No, I got it right. 1 female to 1 to 3 males. So here's a picture of a golden lion tamarin being studied by researchers from the zoo, but you can see here they are having collars. These are radio collars. There's a little wire here, that's the antenna. This allows these groups, this mating group, to be tracked as they move through the forest, and they're interested in their feeding behavior, how often they spend time on the ground, how often they spend time in the trees. And I mentioned that was important because when they raised it in the zoo, the tamarins would go on the ground because the ground was safe. And when they were released back in the Brazil, they went to the ground and got eaten. So they wanted to know how often these tamarins who spend time on the ground in the wild, these are wild monkeys, and tracking them was part of the study. If you look over here, there's several adults. So golden lion tamarins in Brazil are not monogamous and lean more towards the polyandrous group. Monogamy exists, just like it does in the acorn woodpecker, but there's a bias in the larger groups to polyandry versus polygyny. Polygyny is less common and or sometimes not even observed. Why is life hard for these tamarins? You may have noticed in a picture that I gave you, they always have twins. So raising twins by an ape is not going to be an easy task. By a monkey, it's not an easy task. And presumably raising twins makes life hard. And that has put the constraint to evolve cooperative breeding. And in this case, a bias towards polyandry, we believe, by the same type of arguments that were developed today for the acorn woodpecker. I introduced you to acorn woodpecker primarily because the data there is better. It's a local species, and several University of California groups, a lot of them in Berkeley, have been studying acorn woodpeckers for a long time, which is why the data set is the best. The other ones for the other species that I gave you, naked mole rats and golden lion tamarins, one is Brazil in a forest, it's harder to study, and the other one in the desert underground, even harder to study. So the evidence is much more restricted. With that, we end today's lecture, and I'd be happy to take questions in the chat. But let me then stop share, and I'll come back to you in a minute to answer questions.